Thank you for following me over to the little book of Ruth. I'll give you a minute. It's a little obscure, but it's worth visiting. The book of Ruth. Over the years, there have been a lot of books written about mother-in-laws. A lot of them have been joke books. But this is no joke book, folks. This is a love story. I'd like here this morning, as we go to the book of Ruth, we're going to begin here this morning a series of 3 messages that seem to radiate out of the book of Ruth. Our message here this morning, the first one in the series of 3, will take a closer look at Ruth, the daughter-in-law. Next Sabbath, we'll be talking about Ruth, the bride. And then a few weeks down the road, when I get a chance to come and be with you here for worship service, we'll take a look at Boaz the Redeemer. But for now, we're focusing on Ruth. It seems like if we were to take this little book and draw from it a central idea, at least the central idea that I'd really like to emphasize this morning, and that is that more than anything else, God honors givers. God honors givers. The book itself, we don't know exactly when it was written. Chances are very good the book was written about the time of David. We're not real sure either who the author is. There's some indications that it may very well have been Samuel. It's actually a picture from David's family picture album. And as we take a look at this photo in David's family album, we discover that it's really a story about David's great-great-grandmother. Nothing particularly unique about the book. It is 4 chapters and only 85 verses. But one kind of interesting detail is that there are 250 ands. Almost every verse, and some of the verses have multiple ands in them, which is kind of an interesting, maybe insignificant detail. I don't really think whoever wrote it would have gotten a commendation in writing class. Teachers aren't inclined to encourage writing a lot of ands, but the book of Ruth has many, many ands embedded in the verses. A little bit about the family. Of course, it's primarily a story about Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons, Milion and Chilion. Elimelech's family, of course, lived in Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem, as we are familiar with, is only about 5 short miles from Jerusalem. And I understand some of you have had the opportunity to visit it and see it firsthand. Bethlehem literally sits on a promontory on a bit of a mountainous ridge that runs from Bethlehem up to Jerusalem. Bethlehem itself overlooks the valley below. Between Bethlehem and the valley below, there are steep, rocky hillsides. And of course, over the millennia, they have terraced those hillsides, and that's where they've planted the olives and the grapes. Down below, in the flatter terrain in the valley below, are the fields. They're undoubtedly the fields where David herded sheep at one time. And these are undoubtedly are the same fields where the angels came to sing and communicate with the shepherds that were herding their flocks in those same fields. More importantly, though, for our worship thoughts today, we're going to emphasize the fact that these are the fields of Boaz. And being the fields of Boaz, of course, one of the more prominent grains that was raised was barley. And by about this time of year, in March and April, those barley fields were beginning to green up. Bethlehem literally means a house of bread. When we come to the time in history when this story takes place, what makes it especially interesting is the fact that there was no bread in Bethlehem, at least in not the abundance that there had been before. There was a bit of a famine going on. And because of the famine, Elimelech packed up his family and traveled 75 miles east over into Moab. And it apparently was a rather wise move because of the impact that the drought was having on Bethlehem and the fact that the crops and those who were dependent upon the crops were suffering because of the drought. So Elimelech moved his family to Moab, and it was a wise move because it was a fertile area in the vicinity of Moab. Both the climate and the terrain was much more receptive. This is actually the area of Moab where previously Lot had went. So it was a rather rich, a land of abundance in Moab. Well, it wasn't very long after they arrived in Moab that the two young men, Milion and Chilion, fell in love with two young ladies, Orpah and Ruth. They married these two girls, Ruth to Milion and Orpah to Chilion. And it wasn't too long after they were married that tragedy struck. Apparently, both of the boys from the time of birth had been rather sickly, somewhat invalids. In fact, the words Milion and Chilion mean to be invalid or sickly. But as providence would have it, not only did Milion and Chilion die, but it wasn't too long after that that Elimelech died. And that left 3 widows. And that sets the table for our story. And what transpired after that? 3 widows. And it wasn't very long before Naomi, in the loneliness of having lost her husband, was keenly interested in returning back to Bethlehem. It had been some 8, 9, 10 years that had transpired since they had made their way down to Moab. And word had it that the drought had somewhat eased and that life was much better now in Bethlehem. So Naomi approached the two girls about going with her back to Bethlehem. And that's where we discover our first interesting insight. Come with me, if you would, to Ruth chapter 1, verse 7. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. And then we drop down to verse 8. And Naomi said unto her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. And then we come to verses 14 and 15 of the same chapter. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. Before we make a few observations about Orpah and her inability to give all and to follow Naomi back to Bethlehem, we want to notice the fact that Naomi gave her the option of staying. And I just can't help but wonder how many more stories there would be like this story if mother-in-laws gave their daughter-in-laws the freedom to make their decisions. How that would affect family dynamics if mother-in-laws left them free to choose. Naomi did. And then we notice that Orpah said, I cannot go with you. I must stay. And the verse brings out, not only was Orpah at the place where she couldn't continue to be attached, to support, to leave that area with Naomi, but the verse that we just read, verse 15, suggests that it was also a deeply spiritual issue, that apparently Orpah had been a convert to the Hebrew faith. And she felt she needed to let Naomi and Ruth go back to Bethlehem by themselves. She would not go with them. But what's even more significant is that it says she turned back to her gods, which suggests to me that Orpah was able to give. But she wasn't able to give everything. It was wonderful serving Naomi's God, Naomi and Elimelech's God, as long as she had a husband and a lover. And life was good. She had a companion. But having lost her companion to death, suddenly life became a lot more difficult. And she decided she could not go with them. You know, it's been said that Christianity has never been tried and found wanting, but it has been tried and found extremely difficult. Orpah could not, as long as following, being a Hebrew, a follower of the Elimelech and Naomi's faith, as long as that meant leaving her home and going with Naomi back to Bethlehem and doing it as a widow to maybe the rest of her life having to help take care of an elderly woman. Orpah could not do it. She had given something, but she was not ready to give everything. And one of the central features of this story is the fact that it contrasts the response of Orpah to the response of Ruth. And before we go on to look closer at Ruth and Ruth's response, I would just like to say a word to those of you that might be new, if not to Christianity, at least to Adventist Christianity. Chances are very good, if you haven't already discovered, you soon will, that life can become very difficult being a faithful believer. And the temptation will be to turn back, to leave and go back to the way of life, back to the original journey that you were on, because it's been tried and found too difficult. Oh, I plead with you, don't give up and turn back. May God help you come to the place where you not just give up something, but you're willing to give up everything. And that's what we see in Ruth. We notice as we take a look at Ruth, and as we take a look at Ruth, interestingly enough, we continue to hear more about Ruth. In fact, Ruth had an impact. Interestingly enough, the name of Orpah is never heard of again. She fades into oblivion because she was not able to give everything. On the other hand, we come to Ruth, and I think Ruth communicates something about how we ought to treat the old folks among us. As we focus on Ruth, we discover that Ruth was able to give love to the lonely. And there's probably no group that is more vulnerable to loneliness than the elderly among us. It's really a story about giving to the lonely and what they need. Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not." And oh, you've read these words many times. You've probably heard them used in wedding sermons. And it's kind of taking these verses out of context. It's really not a husband-wife love that it's talking about here. It is talking more about a daughter-in-law's love for her mother-in-law. Let's revisit those words in verse 16. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord will do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." How do we relate to the old folks among us? How do we respond to the needs of the elderly in our neighborhoods and in our nursing homes? That's really what this story is about. How we respond to the needs of those that are going through intense loneliness. You know, we're a very, in this country, we're very funny about age. Everybody wants to live a long time, but nobody wants to get old. not quite sure what to do with people when they get old. And there's probably never been a culture like this country's culture where we ask the teenagers what to do about the world's problems and put the old folks out to pasture. We're a country of youth. And that influences how we respond to the needs of the elderly. It's just a part of the society in which we live. Losing sight of the needs of the lonely, particularly the lonely elderly. A number of years ago, when I was pastoring in Kansas, I was asked to travel to a small community and conduct a wedding service for a young lady and her groom. And since the wedding itself was going to take place on Sunday, I was invited to come, and I spent the night with a friend of the bride's. And it was there that Sabbath evening, I remember sitting down and visiting with her. She was a single woman, a widow, a teacher in the local public school. She had one more year of teaching, and her plans were to retire. And as I sat there and listened to her story, it wasn't very long till the tears came. And she described her experience, her journey over the past year, and the fact that the loneliness never seems to go away. And she described her struggle over the decision to put her house up for sale, because she had come to the place where she realized that it no longer was going to fit her and her needs. And how, as she went down to the local newspaper and went in to place an ad offering her house for sale, as she approached the door of the newspaper office, how she dreaded doing that and how she wanted to turn and run the opposite direction. It just was totally uncomfortable for her. But she knew that the time was coming when she would have to do that. And not only would she have to sell her home, but she would have to relocate to a different community closer to her children. And I couldn't help but wonder, when she relocates to this other community as a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, what will she find? Will she find a Ruth there that will help meet her needs? From time to time, you have Naomi's come to the Pinion Hills Church. What do they find? Do they find some Ruths here that are aware of their needs and dedicated to helping meet those needs? I'd like to share just a few thoughts for our widows here this morning. You do know, if you're female, even if you're married, they're 5 times more likely for your spouse to die before you do. Most of you ladies are headed towards widowhood. Eventually, for most of you, that experience will come. What would we suggest for our ladies? First of all, the importance of accepting the fact that the loss is permanent. Over the years, I've thought a lot about the fact that my mother after my father's death, and my mother-in-law after my father-in-law's death. Neither one of them ever remarried. And the reality is, statistics indicate that only 1.3% of widow women ever remarry. Maybe it has something to do with accepting the fact that the loss is permanent. Like the lady in Kansas, the loss may never go away. When that special someone has went out of your life and you feel like all of the light has gone out of your life with his death, chances are it's very likely that 10 years later you'll go walk to the closet and see his coat hanging there. And you'll break out in tears. The loss, sense of loss just doesn't seem to go away. The second suggestion that we might make is the importance of getting busy. After your time of loss, the inclination is to withdraw and to isolate. And so, to avoid staying busy. I don't know that you're aware of it here. You don't have a community service center here. We do have one in Grand Junction. And I've noticed over the years that probably 90% of the volunteers at that community service center are widow women. And that tells me that that community service center, even more important than what they're doing for the community, is what they're doing for those women, those ladies, that need to feel like they're making a positive contribution in some way. And the third suggestion is that we continue to make friends. True, when your spouse dies, your circle of friends changes, sometimes rather drastically. And you kind of wonder, am I still worthy of being a friend? Am I still friendly enough to attract other people, to make new friends? And I would simply remind you that you're just as friendly as you ever were. But it probably means a little extra effort to make some new friends, a new circle of friends. And that takes some serious, serious effort. So 3 little suggestions as ladies prepare for widowhood. Then next, I'd like to talk to those of us that have responsibility for meeting the needs of widows. Based on this story, I'd like to suggest, number 1, we make sure that the widows near us have somebody to care. Number 2, that they have a place to live. And number 3, they have something to do. In this story, Ruth provided all 3 for Naomi. The verses we just read about Ruth proves that Naomi had found someone that really cared about her, cared enough to follow her, a Moabite, over to Bethlehem. And that brings me to the second fascinating fact, is that Ruth was willing to go where she wanted to live, not where Ruth was most comfortable living. And I realize chances are very good if you have elderly parents or loved ones. The time will come when you'll have to help them make a decision about where to live. And the tendency will to expect them to live where you would like to live. Ruth was willing to go with Naomi to where Naomi was most comfortable. back in Bethlehem. And number 3, something to do. It's a fascinating human interest story because eventually, over in the 4th chapter, you read about the fact that after Ruth and Boaz were married, they had baby Obed. And it specifically says that Ruth brought baby Obed and put her on Naomi's knee. Ruth knew the importance of giving her elderly mother-in-law something significant to do. Someone to care, someplace to live, and something to do. A common need of the elderly, particularly widows. The yellow morning sun made a brilliant patch of light on the papered wall. And the morning sky was blue, blue as in the days of the wheat harvest. That was in the days when Grandpa, was young, when he would work all day with a sweating back in the white hot sun. But Grandpa remembered, and in that memory he rose to go to the garden, one step at a time. He could make it, one step with the left foot and one step with the right foot, pull the cane along. Oh, why must he hobble so? He wondered. And as he hobbled, he reached out for the porch railing, and after that, the picket fence. They would help him get to the garden. There were weeds in the garden. He would pull a few weeds, as in the days when he would weed a whole corn patch in a single morning. Back on the farm before his children made him move to town into this cramped little house with its tiny garden to replace the once great field. Garden, garden in the morning calls, pull all the weeds before the evening falls. Grandpa leaned upon his cane. Could he reach down to the top of that weed? Or was he falling? As he tried to steady himself, losing his balance, pitching forward in such an undignified way. And as he did so, he knew he was losing his balance and he was going to lose the battle. So he cried out, "Mama, Mama." Grandma heard his calling. Grandpa had fallen in the garden again. She would go and help him up. She would help him back into the house where he ought to be. He shouldn't disobey the doctor like that. Oh, Mama. Oh, I do wish Papa would be quiet. He's going to wake the neighbors. Can't he see? I'm coming, I'm coming. Mama. She would walk across the grass. She would use the cane also. Carefully, there he was, lying there in the garden, an old man, unable to raise himself. Mama, more quietly this time. But by this time, she was closer now, and she would slowly make it over to him. And as she did so, she would reach down and desperately try to reach him. She would reach down and help him as she had done so many times before. She would hold her cane for him to climb on. Here, Papa, Papa, don't pull on the cane so. You're going to make me fall. Careful, Mama, or you'll fall too. She couldn't hold him, not anymore. Perhaps she would just sink down beside him and rest a bit. Careful, Mama, as she slowly sunk beside him. They both just lay there in the garden for a while, resting, gaining strength. It was early in the morning. Perhaps Johnny with the golden hair was on his way to school. Perhaps Johnny with the golden hair would stop and help them up. Papa, you should never have left the house. But Mama, I have to get out to the garden once in a while. Johnny with the golden hair thought he heard their voices again. He would look outside. Yes, the old couple next door had fallen in the garden again. How many times had he helped them up? And it was always the same time in the morning, just as he was about to start for school. And he thought once again, the poor old couple. Johnny, Johnny with the golden hair would come. Johnny with the golden hair would come and help them up. So Ruth gives us some insights on how to relate to the elderly and the lonely around us. Lastly, we're going to notice from Boaz. Again, we're talking about being givers. And we're going to suggest that with Boaz, God invites us to not just give everything, but to give generously. Notice with me our final thought, Ruth 2, verses 8 through 9. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field, that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art thirsty, go to the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. And we drop down to 14. And Boaz said unto her at mealtime, Come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip of the morsel. And she sat beside the reapers. And when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, Let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. And let fall also some of the handful of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean, and rebuke her not. So she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. What it describes for us is the fact that over a 5-gallon bucket full of barley had been made available to Ruth. What Boaz suggests here, that God wants us to give generously. Boaz gave generously to the needy, to the less fortunate. To Ruth the destitute, he made sure that she was protected and that she had an ample supply for her and Naomi. God honored her generosity, his generosity. And I can't help but wonder if those around me see me as a generous person. Interesting, one little newspaper article describing Adventists. Adventists had visited a large city for a convention, and the newspaper article said, describing these Adventists, when the Adventists arrived in town with a $10 bill and the 10 Commandments, and they never broke either. The impression they left in the community where they were at. Generosity. Are we known as a generous people? God honored Boaz as a generous individual. His generosity to help take care of Ruth and Naomi. So to sum it up, we can't help but notice the results in verse 13. And then she said, Let me find favor in thy sight. For verse 13, rather. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went in with her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. Baby Obed was the result. Why is that so significant? First of all, because Boaz's mother was Rahab, a Philistine prostitute. in spite of that, Boaz's generosity was honored by God, and the result was baby Boaz. Boaz, born to a Moabitess woman, Ruth. Baby Boaz, the great-grandfather of David, the great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus. God honored Ruth and Boaz's generosity, their givingness. I'm convinced God is still looking for givers. Because more than anything else, He wants to honor those who, unlike Orpah, couldn't give everything, but eventually, like Ruth, did give everything. Honoring givers who, like Boaz, share generously. And God honors us in the same way that He did them, by providing a heritage that is incredible. At the age of 16, my mother and my father were separating. And the marriage had been moving in that direction for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. As my dad's alcoholism spiraled downwards, it finally all came to a head when they lost our home to a repossession. We had to move down to Grand Junction. And with my mom and dad's divorce, suddenly my mother was faced with the reality that she was going to, even though she had never worked outside the home in her life, the time had come when she was going to have to get some education and go to work to feed her 6 children. And as she did that, years later, I've come to appreciate what an incredible giver she was. She went to school. We went on welfare. She eventually got a job as a medical secretary in a doctor's office there in Grand Junction, and began to work her way out of the deep hole of debt that my dad had taken us into. Sole provider for her 6 children, all of them younger than myself at the age of 16. I've never seen anyone else since then that gave as much as my mother did to help finish raising her 6 children as a single parent. Gave and gave and gave everything she had for her family. God honored that givingness. Fortunately, all 6 of us are still very much alive. All 6 of us made it possible for my mother to be in her own home when she died of pancreatic cancer. We were all there. Since then, they are not only all alive, but they all love one another. God honored my mother's givingness. What I failed to tell you is that her name is Ruth. God honors the givingness of Ruth's. God will honor your dedication as a giver, particularly to the needy and the less fortunate, the lonely around you. May God help us to recognize who they are and give all we can to love them as God would design. And then He will honor our giving experience as well.